Hey everyone, I just tried, and failed, to read The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, so let's talk about it. It's going to be light on the visuals, so feel free to put this on in the background while you work. Let's get to it. I want to preface this video by saying I understand how beloved this series is, and if you love The Wheel of Time, that's great. I'm glad it has an audience. I'm not trying to take that away from you. But I hope by the end of this rant you can understand why I personally just couldn't get into it, even if I happen to say some things you're really not going to like. Now, I've had this series on the pile since 2022, and it's pretty much the reason I burned out halfway through 2023. The commenter who suggested it only asked for the first 3 books, but I figured since I've had all 14 on my shelf since 2013, I'd finally sit down and get through them. I didn't go into them blind. I'd tried to read the series once before around 2017, and back then I burned out after the first 3 books, but I was determined to get through them all this time. That didn't happen. I got 2/3 of the way into book 2, The Great Hunt, and dropped it like a bag of rocks. I just couldn't read another word. And for that reason, I'm not going to give The Great Hunt a ranking. But I did get through The Eye of the World in total, so let's start with that. If you've never read it, The Eye of the World is a book about a bunch of small-town farmers who find themselves whisked away from their normal lives when a powerful sorceress discovers their fates are bound together by the Wheel of Time, and together they just might be able to save the world from the Dark One, who is on the cusp of returning. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it is. The Eye of the World reads to me like Lord of the Rings fanfiction that's been edited into its own work, and I can already hear you typing out that essay in the comments. Even if you disagree with that statement, you've got to admit there are quite a few similarities. Both stories start out in quiet pastoral towns that come under attack by agents of an evil force. The leader of the team is a powerful user of magic associated with a colour. The main antagonist spends the whole story off-screen, and the protagonists instead face off against his underlings, an army of weird little guys led by faceless monsters in hoods. The protagonists flee their pursuers by crossing a river with a ferry. They both travel through an ancient city now corrupted by evil. Both stories ultimately end at a mountain called Doom, spelling notwithstanding. They both technically take place in a different period of Earth's history according to the lore. There are large differences to offset those similarities. A lot of them are things I really liked. Derivative as it is at first glance, the world of the Wheel of Time is great once you get into the details. There's a lot of depth to it in terms of history, in terms of culture, in terms of geography, in terms of politics, to the point where it feels as well realised a place as Middle-earth or Westeros or the world of The Witcher. A lot of fantasy novels read like their worlds spring into being on page 1 and vanish like smoke at the acknowledgements, but not here. It feels like it's there, existing beyond the prose, and if you could just leave the story behind and wander through it, you'd never run out of interesting things to find. In fact, I honestly wish I could leave the story behind a lot of the time, because it always felt like way more interesting stuff was happening away from the main characters in the background. Not to say there weren't great moments where the world and the plot intersected. Rand seeing Loghain in Caemlyn springs immediately to mind. I've had that chapter stuck in my head since I first read the book in 2017, but they were the exception rather than the rule, and that's really the source of so much of my frustration with the book, because you've got this fantastic world filled with so many interesting ideas and places and characters, and you barely get to see any of it. Instead, you spend so much of the book walking to a city with bland Althor, the most milquetoast boring man to ever be a lead protagonist. I really couldn't stand Rand. Getting through his chapters, and thus most of the book, felt like drawing blood from a stone, because his entire personality is that he's a reluctant hero, and too much time is spent on him whining about how he doesn't want to save the world. I wish the other viewpoint characters had been given more focus, because I much preferred reading from Perrin or Nynaeve's perspectives, and for that matter, I much preferred the story once the group got split up, because the journeys they took to meet again again were compelling, and you actually get to see more of this really cool world. Even the other non-POV characters ran rings around Rand, but none so much as Moraine. I hope her back is okay from single-handedly carrying the entire book. She, and to a lesser extent Lan, were the best characters in the story, which goes right back to the world building. I'm a sucker for witch politics, and the Aes Sedai delivered on that in spades, if only from a distance. Having read books 2 and 3 before, the Aes Sedai plot is pretty much the only reason I wanted to get through the series when I went back to it in 2023, because that is still, even after dropping the lot of them, such an interesting idea to me. As are their enemies, the White Cloaks. I wish the book had been more about them, and the politics in Caemlyn, than what it was actually about. I think the pacing takes a lot of the blame for that. To go back to the fanfiction comparison, this book is paced like a bad fic. Absurd amounts of time is spent establishing people or places, who then just vanish from the plot. So much of the book is spent trying to reach Tar Valon, and then in the last act they decide, just kidding, we're going to the Mountains of Doom for the climax instead. New ideas and new characters are introduced at the last second with no setup, despite how they could have been threaded into the story earlier as Chekhov's guns. And so many events correspond directly to things that happen in The Lord of the Rings, as I've already mentioned, just swapped around a little and expanded beyond insanity, because fans would be mad if they weren't included. Now, The Eye of the World is hardly the only fantasy novel to do this sort of thing. I feel in a way all of them indulge in it for better or worse. It's just a matter of how much any individual reader is willing to tolerate, and this was beyond my limit. I would take a chainsaw to this manuscript if I could. There is so much I would cut out, but I also understand a lot of that stuff is part of the reason some people love the book, so different strokes, I guess. I think A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons by George Martin might actually be worse in terms of pacing and unnecessary world building, but I enjoyed those books much more than The Eye of the World because they didn't feel so much like a retread of The Lord of the Rings. And I also much prefer Martin's writing style to Jordan's. The prose in The Eye of the World is so turgid and repetitive, and with such a huge reliance on prophecy, this was never a book I was going to click with at this point in my life. Maybe this was something special in the 1990s, but it doesn't tackle the genre in a grounded way like the works of George Martin, Robin Hobb, or Andrei Sapkowski, and it doesn't go all in on the fantasy like the works of Brandon Sanderson, Adrian Tchaikovsky, or Steven Erikson either. It just feels like The Lord of the Rings, but too much. There are good ideas here and there, like the Aes Sedai and the Children of the Light, but they're buried under so much tedium. I'll be the first to admit I'm not the target audience for this sort of book. I'm always going to prefer stories with a bit more grit, and at this point the genre has moved beyond the standard Tolkien setting. But if you're a fan of Brandon Sanderson's work, there might be something here for you. But for me, getting through this book was like pulling teeth, and I'm giving The Eye of the World a C. Sorry. Which brings me to The Great Hunt, the second book of the Wheel of Time. It's a book about, funnily enough, a great hunt to recover the magical Horn of Valere in the midst of a sudden invasion of mysterious origins on the west coast of the continent, and the start of a journey to becoming a Sedai for several unlikely young women. Now, I've technically read this book cover to cover, but it was so long ago that I've pretty much forgotten the last third, so as I said at the start of this video, I'm not going to give it a rating. Instead, I'm going to give my general thoughts. A lot of the stuff I enjoyed about The Eye of the World remained true of The Great Hunt. In fact, a lot of it was even better because it was given much greater focus. The Aes Sedai are given a much larger role, which was fantastic. You get to see so much more of the world, which is fun. There are more points of view, and they're spread much more evenly across the book, which was such a relief. And I am such a sucker for stories where two civilizations without any prior contact crash into each other in a massive conflict. But so much of the stuff I didn't like also returned in a huge way too. Case in point, the book starts with Rand looking for a hiding spot to avoid meeting the leader of the Aes Sedai for 50 pages. There's still so much walking, and it still takes forever to get anywhere, and there are still moments ripped right out of The Lord of the Rings, like a supposedly dead character coming back, and a bad case of Ghost Army Ex Machina, although that last one is only going from memory. The way Rand just cannot figure out about the identity of a certain character he shares the road with for a lot of the book made my blood boil too. Anyone with a single brain cell would see that character and go evil instantly, and naturally I still didn't like the way it was written. There wasn't really a specific moment that made me drop the book. It was more of a build-up of bad over hundreds and hundreds of pages that wore me down until I couldn't stomach the thought of reading another word. I wanted to keep going to exist in the world and see where the Aes Sedai plot thread went, but I just couldn't. And the funny thing is, I remember more scenes from The Great Hunt fondly than I do The Eye of the World or The Dragon Reborn, which I don't recall at all from that first read, like the discovery of the Horn and a bunch of stuff in Tar Valon, but I just couldn't do it anymore. The Wheel of Time is what comes to mind when I think of the archetypical modern epic fantasy series. It's got the world, it's got the characters, it's got the factions, it's got Tolkien's shadow hanging over it with every single word, but the very things that make it that archetypical example are what I cannot stand about it. I feel like the guy who's gone back to watch Seinfeld after hearing all these good things, only to think it's unfunny. Everything the Wheel of Time does has been done better by someone else since, in my opinion. Although I would be lying if I said it wasn't fun to discover how authors like George Martin or Brandon Sanderson have cherry-picked certain things for their stories. A Song of Ice and Fire certainly might owe a crazy amount to the Wheel of Time, but in my opinion, Martin did it better. Robert Jordan and his fantasy series just ain't for me. And that's the video. This one took way longer than I wanted. It was supposed to be out last November, but life and a bunch of other stuff got in the way. I've been thinking more and more about where to take this channel going forward, and I think I've finally cracked it. Going back to weekly videos is impossible, as I've said, so instead we're going to try a grab bag of all the things I've read in my spare time over the last little while. If all goes to plan, you'll be seeing the first of them sometime soon. Here's the pile as it stands. The next series on the docket is the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which I have yet to finish. I've still got book 10 to get through, so wish me luck. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did and you want to support the channel, please like, subscribe, and share it around. Let me know what you thought down in the comments too. If you agree, if you don't, I love hearing what other people think. Anyway, that's all from me. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.